Welcome to a TEAL Center presentation on formative assessment. In this session, we'll consider some definitions of formative assessment and some reasons that it's important for teachers to use formative assessment strategies in helping their students learn. In fact, some research findings indicate that formative assessment has the greatest impact on student learning and achievement. So, what is formative assessment? Let's begin with some definitions. In a 1998 work, D. Roy Sadler defines formative assessment as the use of informal, ongoing, authentic assessments to generate feedback to improve and accelerate student learning. Sadler also says that use of formative assessment can short-circuit the randomness and inefficiency of trial and error learning. In 2006, James Popham, a noted expert on educational testing, and again in 2007, the Council of Chief State School Officers defined formative assessment as a process for making instructional adjustments based on feedback about student performance. It is commonly said that formative assessment is assessment for learning, as opposed to summative assessment, which is assessment of learning. Summative assessment is what we're all familiar with. At the end of a unit of learning, or at the end of the academic year, students are given some kind of quiz or test or exam, some way to determine that the students have learned what was intended in the lesson or the course of study. This is assessment of learning. Formative assessment, on the other hand, is assessment for learning. Formative assessment techniques allow the teacher to assess how each student is doing every step of the way as the student is in the process of learning. What the teacher learns from this informal assessment is what the student does and does not understand, where the student still needs help, and where the teacher can make adjustments to help the student ensure that he or she masters the content or skill. So, formative assessment is a process of informal and interactive and ongoing assessment where you, as the teacher, can make instructional adjustments and give feedback to the student on his or her learning. And guess what? The student also gives feedback to you on what he or she didn't understand from your teaching. I want to reiterate some points about formative assessment here because these are extremely important concepts. Formative assessment occurs when the teacher provides feedback to students about specific qualities of their work and how to improve. When teachers know how students are progressing and where they're having trouble, the teacher can make appropriate instructional adjustments. The vast majority of genuine formative assessment is informal, with interactive and timely feedback and response. Effective teacher feedback to students on their progress leads to students engaging in self-reflection. They can reflect on the process they're using to learn, and they can consider new ways to approach mastering the content or the skill. Student self-reflection on the processes they are using to learn is critical for students to become self-regulated learners. As I mentioned at the start of this presentation, it is widely and empirically argued that formative assessment has the greatest impact on student learning and achievement. But I also want to emphasize that formative and summative assessment are interconnected. They seldom stand alone. Key elements of formative assessment include the following. This comes from the work of Black and William, 1998. Teachers and learners work together to identify student learning goals or outcomes, as well as the criteria for achieving these goals or outcomes. This is extremely important. Teachers and students must collaboratively set and monitor learning goals. The second element, teachers and learners engage in rich conversations about student learning and performance. These conversations continually build and go deeper. The third element, teachers provide effective, timely feedback that enables students to advance their learning. The fourth element, students are actively involved in their own learning. They take an interest in their progress toward their goals. They monitor their own learning progress, and they inform the teacher about where they need additional support before they can master the content or skill. And the last element, teachers respond to students' identified learning needs and strengths by modifying their teaching approaches to ensure that students master the content or skill. Here are some key questions that you can encourage your students to ask of themselves. When you teach the student to ask, "Where am I going?" you're helping the student have a clear vision of the ultimate learning goal and the progression of sub-goals needed to get there. With writing, for example, students need to see examples of both strong and weak work, and then use these examples to develop criteria for quality so that they can judge their own work. In teaching students to ask, "Where am I now?" you're helping students to assess their own learning and also priming them to receive and give regular descriptive feedback. After the student identifies the target, that is, where he or she is headed, and the current state of his or her learning, you can teach the student to ask, "How can I close the gap?" If you help students to focus on one learning target at a time, you can encourage students to engage in self-reflection and self-monitoring. So what are some of the implications for classroom practice? You want to mutually set goals with students. You want to encourage students to engage in self-reflection and self-regulated learning. You want to give effective feedback to students that helps students recognize the next steps and how to take them. You want to set and celebrate milestones and landmarks with students. And most importantly, you want always to be confident that every student can improve. Think about paperless routines that can give you a quick check for understanding when you're working with a group of students on a focus lesson. A few of these routines are listed here. You'll find more ideas in the TEAL Formative Assessment fact sheet. Let's consider a few of these routines. Think, pair, share, or write, pair, share are easy ways that give everyone a few minutes of talk time to process their thinking. To set this up appropriately, you have to have a routine too as the teacher. You give your students 2 minutes of silent time, and that includes the teacher, in which the students are to think about or write their responses to a prompt that you've given them. Next, each student turns to a partner, and the two take turns sharing their responses, 1 minute each, to the question or the prompt. Then you can do a popcorn type of activity where you sample responses from a few students. This should be quick and it should be organized, and it will give you a good sense of what students know and what they're struggling with. Another technique is to use exit slips. These are one-question prompts that allow you to check for understanding. You ask each student to turn in an index card or a half sheet of paper with his or her response to your question, and you can then check whether the student understood the focus lesson as you intended it. With whole groups, you can do this through a show of hands. For example, you can take a survey with a question such as, "How many agree with the author?" or the conclusion or the statement, whatever, and ask them to raise their hands to show agreement. Or you can say, "Who thinks the next step will be?" and you suggest what that next step is, and then ask them to raise their hands if they agree. A similar technique is to ask them to indicate whether they understand your instructions by showing a thumbs up, that's a yes, a thumbs down, that's a no, or a thumb sideways, that's a not sure. This is a good way to get students to tell you how well they understood directions, or even the content or a skill you've just taught. This can serve as a general test of whether the students are ready to move on, or if they have lingering questions. A similar activity is to ask them to give me 5. This asks students to use their fingers to give a Likert-type scale of responses. For example, a 5 is, hey, I got it, I can start working on my own. A 4 is, I think I got it, but I might have a question. 3 is, I could use a partner to help me on this. 2 is, I'm not clear. And 1 is, I need to hear those directions all over again. This is a good way, without asking the student to verbalize, for you to determine who understands and who needs extra help. The list here indicates various ways you can check for understanding. These are writing to learn prompts. For example, entry slips, exit slips, crystal ball, found poems, etc. You can use these no matter what content area you're teaching, not just for language arts, but also for mathematics, science, social studies, etc. You ask students to use half pieces of paper, or index cards, or reflection folders with pages stapled in them, and to write just a few sentences in response to a prompt you give them. Using prompts, such as the ones listed here, help you to check your students' understanding before or after a lesson, and give you a sense of whether and how to adjust your instruction. Student responses to these prompts are not pieces of writing that you grade or correct. The main purpose of using them is to get feedback on student learning. For example, collect exit slips from your students at the end of each class. Ask them to respond to one or more of the following. Number 1, the one big thing I learned in today's or tonight's class is, and they fill in the blank. Number 2, the one thing I would like to learn more about is, and they fill in the blank. Number 3, one thing I'm not clear about and could use more help with is, and they fill in the blank. The entry slip can be used in the same way to ask the student to complete these same sentences about the last class session they attended. Another example is the newspaper headline technique. Ask students to write a headline about the main thing they learned in your class today or tonight. You can see from the list that there are several different ways to elicit similar information about student learning. Using the crystal ball technique, you can ask students to write about what they think will happen next in a story they're reading or in a procedure you're teaching. Select one of these techniques and try to incorporate it into your teaching. Keep a reflection journal of your own so that you can record how well the technique worked in your class, how the students responded, what you learned by using this technique, and how you might change it the next time you use it. If you keep a reflection journal about your teaching, you'll be able to review your own progress over time as you refine your teaching practice. Conferencing with students and looking at their work can provide insights into their skills as well as the metacognitive strategies that they're using. Are you hosting writing conferences with your students right now? If so, do you follow guidelines similar to the ones presented here? You might want to audio record one or two of your conferences just for your own reflection. Listen to the ratio of talk time to see who's doing most of the talking, you or the student. It's eye-opening to listen to a recording of your conference with a student. It can give you a sense of your own strengths as well as whether you might need to make some changes to your technique. Did you make the most of the teachable moment? When you listen to the recording, you'll be able to determine if there was a teachable moment and if you were able to make the most of it. Did the conference really only last 5 minutes, or did it run a lot longer? Did it end with an action item for the student? Reflecting on our own practice means taking time to capture a glimpse of ourselves in the mirror. Reflection work is assignment number 2 in this course, so if you are intrigued by this concept, you might want to choose that assignment. You can encourage your students to assess their own work. As they complete a task, teach them to reflect on these questions. What did I do well? What might I improve? And what resources were most helpful to me? When self-evaluation becomes a part of what students do routinely while they are learning, they are well on the road to becoming self-regulated learners. Always keep in mind that adult educators are addicted to that moment when a learner's eyes light up, when the teaching becomes learning. May your days be filled with such moments. Thank you for your attention, and have fun using some of these formative assessment techniques.